I smelled the smoke before I saw the lights, thick and sweet like burnt pine and cheap charcoal drifting across 80 acres of land that didn't belong to a single one of the 500 strangers laughing on it. And that's when I knew Victoria Hale had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The hum of generators rattled through the ground under my boots, mixing with country music blasting from portable speakers and the dull metallic clink of beer cans hitting tailgates. And down below, my pasture, my grandfather's pasture, was buried under tents, RVs, folding chairs, and people who had no idea they were standing in the middle of something they were never invited to survive legally. Because this wasn't a campground, and it sure as hell wasn't public land. It was mine. I stood there on the ridge with the dry wind pressing against my jacket, tasting dust and diesel in the back of my throat, watching as a line of SUVs rolled through a broken section of fence that hadn't been accidentally damaged at all, headlights cutting across grazing paths that had been carefully maintained for decades. And at the center of it all, standing beside a banner that read, Willow Creek Community Freedom Festival, was Victoria, smiling like she'd just opened Disneyland, clipboard tucked under her arm, white Lexus parked like a throne behind her, waving people in as if she owned every inch of what they were trampling. I didn't say a word when I first saw it, not when someone dragged a fire pit too close to my hay storage, not when a kid kicked over a boundary marker like it was a toy, not even when one of the RVs parked right along the edge of my lower pasture where the ground dips just enough to matter, because what they didn't know, what Victoria definitely didn't know, was that land like this doesn't forgive ignorance, and neither do the things that live on it. The air felt wrong. Electric in a way you only notice when something is about to shift, like the moment before a storm breaks but the sky's still clear, and I could hear it beneath the noise if I focused hard enough. The distant low movement from the far side of the field, subtle, controlled, patient, because unlike the chaos below, not everything on this property reacted without thinking. Victoria caught sight of me eventually, lifted her hand in that fake, polished wave she used at HOA meetings, the kind that said she believed she'd already won, and even from that distance I could see her lips form the words community event. Like that explained everything, like that erased deeds and boundaries and 40 years of ownership. And I almost laughed right there, because she thought this was about rules she could bend and permits she could reinterpret. She thought inviting 500 people onto private land made it hers. She thought I'd come storming down that hill yelling, demanding, playing right into the kind of scene she could spin in her favor, but I didn't move. Not then, not yet, because I'd already seen enough to understand what she'd set in motion, and more importantly, how to let it finish. The music got louder, the smoke thicker, and somewhere down in that crowd someone cheered as another group squeezed through the broken fence line, and I just stood there, breathing it in, counting the variables, letting the night settle into place, because sometimes the fastest way to win isn't to stop the mistake. It's to let it grow until it can't be ignored, and Victoria had just turned my land into a stage. She just didn't realize who was writing the ending. I grew up with the sound of gravel crunching under tires before sunrise and the smell of warm hay rising with the morning fog, the kind of place where you knew every fence post by memory and every acre had a purpose, even if it did not look like much to someone driving by at 50 miles an hour, and this land beneath those campers' boots was not just dirt to me. It was 80 acres my grandfather carved out of nothing back in 1972 when Willow Creek was barely more than a gas station and a diner. And he built everything here with his own hands, from the cedar fencing that still lined the eastern ridge to the long, low barn that held the cattle through winter storms that could freeze a man's breath mid-sentence. I still remember being 8 years old, sitting on the tailgate of his old Ford, watching him run his hand along the backs of the herd like he was counting something more than livestock. And he told me once that land only stays yours if you understand it better than anyone who tries to take it. Not louder, not angrier, just smarter, and that stuck with me in a way nothing else ever did. Because out here mistakes are not corrected by apologies, they are corrected by consequences. By the time he passed, I was the only one who stayed. The only one who learned how the low pasture held water after a heavy rain, how the northern fence line shifted half an inch every winter with the frost, and how the herd moved as one body when they felt pressure, not panic, not chaos, but something controlled and deliberate, like a current you could not see until you stepped into it. and that knowledge mattered more than any piece of paper sitting in a county office. I rebuilt parts of this ranch myself, replaced broken boards, upgraded gates, installed new tracking collars on the cattle, not because I needed to, but because I knew one day someone would look at this land and think it was empty and used, something waiting to be claimed, and I wanted to be ready for that moment long before it ever came. The irony was I almost sold it once, about 3 years back, when developers started circling the area, offering numbers that sounded good on paper but never felt right in my gut, because they talked about subdivisions and amenities and turning this place into something it was never meant to be. And when I said no, politely at first, then firmly, I started seeing more of people like Victoria, clipboard types with smiles that never quite reached their eyes. People who believed ownership was flexible if you applied enough pressure in the right places. She had been around longer than I realized, showing up at county meetings, pushing zoning conversations, talking about community integration, like that meant something other than control. And I kept my distance, because I had seen enough to know she was not interested in cooperation. She was interested in expansion, standing there on that ridge now, watching 500 people scatter across land she had no right to touch. I could feel every inch of history under my boots, like it was alive, like it was waiting. And for a split second, there was a flicker of something that felt dangerously close to doubt. Because no matter how well you know a place, seeing it overrun like that makes you question whether you waited too long, whether you let the wrong person get too comfortable. And that was the moment most people would have charged down that hill, tried to force control back through noise and confrontation, but I did not, because the one thing my grandfather taught me that mattered most was this: you do not fight for land like this by reacting. You fight by choosing the ground where the outcome is already decided. And as I watched Victoria laugh with a group of campers who had no idea what they had just stepped into, I realized she had already crossed a line she could not step back from. She just did not know it yet, and neither did anyone else down there. I first met Victoria Hale on a Tuesday morning that smelled like fresh mulch and artificial citrus, the kind of scent that tries too hard to feel clean, and she was standing in the middle of a property line meeting like she already owned the outcome, white blouse pressed sharp enough to cut glass, sunglasses resting on her head like a crown she had not earned, and a clipboard tucked under her arm that she tapped every time someone else spoke, like she was marking down mistakes instead of listening. Her voice was smooth, practiced, the kind that made simple words sound official. And when she said phrases like community benefit or shared access, people nodded before they even understood what she was suggesting, because she did not argue. She framed things in a way that made resistance sound unreasonable, like you were the problem for not agreeing. I remember the way she looked at my land that day, not with curiosity or respect, but with calculation, like she was measuring how easily it could be absorbed into something bigger, something she could package and sell. And when she introduced herself, she did not ask about the ranch. She asked how long it had been underutilized. And that was the first time I realized she had already decided what this place was worth without ever stepping foot past the gate. Over the next few months, I saw her more often, always in motion, always accompanied by someone from the county or a contractor or a couple dressed like they were touring future homes. And every time she passed by the fence line, she slowed down just enough to look, to study, to imagine. And it was subtle at first, little things that could be dismissed if you were not paying attention. Survey flags appearing near the road that were not mine. A temporary sign posted on a neighboring lot advertising future community expansion. A question at a public meeting about access roads that just happened to align with the edge of my property. And every time I pushed back, calmly, with documentation, she smiled like she expected that, like it was part of a process she had already run before. The thing about people like Victoria is they do not start by taking. They start by redefining, shifting language until what belongs to you becomes something negotiable, something flexible. And by the time you realize what is happening, they have already built a narrative where you look like the obstacle. I heard about her reputation from a neighbor who had dealt with her 2 years earlier, a retired teacher who told me in a low voice that Victoria did not lose, not because she was always right, but because she knew how to outlast people, how to bury them in paperwork and pressure until they either gave in or walked away. And she had help. A husband with ties to the city council, a network of contractors who owed her favors, and a habit of turning small wins into leverage for bigger ones. Standing on that ridge now, watching her move through the crowd below like she was hosting a private event, greeting strangers by name, directing traffic, laughing like this was all perfectly normal. I could see exactly how she had gotten this far, because to everyone else, this looked organized, approved, even legitimate, and that was her real skill, making something illegal feel inevitable, like it was always meant to happen this way. She glanced up at me again, just for a second, and there was a flicker of recognition there. Not concern, not yet, just acknowledgement, like she was checking a box, confirming that I had seen what she was doing. And that was the moment I understood she believed this was already over, that she thought bringing 500 people onto my land would force my hand, push me into reacting in a way she could control. But what she did not understand was that I had been watching her long before tonight, learning the rhythm of how she operated, and more importantly, where she left gaps she thought no one would notice. And as the music swelled and the lights flickered across the pasture, I realized she had just created the perfect situation for those gaps to matter. She just did not see them yet, and by the time she did, it would be far too late to fix what she had already set in motion. The first real crack showed up just after midnight, when the music dipped for a moment and I could finally hear what the land was trying to tell me beneath the noise. The low, uneven hum of engines idling where they should not be, the sharp hiss of propane tanks too close to dry grass, the hollow thud of boots stepping over ground that had not been packed for that kind of traffic in decades. And I watched as a line of campers dragged folding tables straight through a section of fencing that had already been loosened earlier that evening, the wooden posts tilting just enough to make it easy. Too easy, like someone had prepared it in advance. The smell shifted too, less like a backyard gathering and more like something unstable, fuel mixing with trampled vegetation and overheated generators. And that was when I started noticing details most people would miss. The way vehicles were parking closer together as space filled up, the way people kept pushing further inward instead of staying near the entrance, the way Victoria kept waving them deeper into the property with that same confident motion, like she needed density, like the crowd itself was part of the plan. I made my way halfway down the ridge, slow enough not to draw attention, close enough to hear conversations, and what I heard confirmed everything. People talking about overnight stays, about morning activities, about how this was going to be a weekend thing, not a one-night event. And that was not what any permit would ever allow, not on land classified the way mine was, not without inspections, safety controls, and permissions that I knew for a fact had never been granted. I stepped into the edge of the light just long enough for Victoria to notice me again, and this time she walked over, heels pressing into dirt that was not designed for them, smile already in place before she even spoke, and when she reached me, the scent of expensive perfume cut through the smoke like it did not belong in the same world as everything else around us. She tilted her head slightly and said, "You should have come down earlier, Ethan. This is exactly what the community needed." Like she was offering me credit for something I had nothing to do with. And I let her finish, let her explain how everything was coordinated and within guidelines. Even as I could see behind her a group setting up a second fire pit less than 20 feet from a hay stack that had taken me 2 weeks to prepare for winter feed. I asked one question, simple and direct, about overnight occupancy, and for the first time, just for a fraction of a second, her smile hesitated, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. And then it snapped right back into place as she said, "We have everything handled," without actually answering, and that was all I needed to hear. I nodded like I accepted it, like I was choosing not to push further, and she seemed to relax into that, already turning away before I even stepped back, already shifting her attention to the next group arriving through the broken fence line. Because in her mind, this was the moment I backed down, the moment she established control not just over the land, but over me. And for a second, standing there with the noise swelling back up around us and the lights stretching deeper into the pasture, I let myself feel what it would be like if she was right, if this kept going, if by morning this place looked less like a ranch and more like something I did not recognize anymore. And that was the second false signal she needed to see, the illusion that I was overwhelmed, that I was outmatched, because the truth was the opposite. Every step she took deeper into that field tightened the situation around her. Every camper she invited in multiplied the consequences she could not walk away from. And as I turned and walked back up the ridge without another word, Leaving her behind in the glow of something she thought she controlled, I could feel it settling into place. The realization that this was no longer just a violation, it was a chain reaction, and she had just pulled the trigger without understanding what it would set off. I did what anyone would expect me to do next, at least on the surface. I pulled out my phone and made the call, standing just far enough up the ridge to keep the noise behind me, but close enough to see everything unfold. And when the dispatcher answered, the words came out steady, controlled, like I was reporting something routine: unauthorized gathering, private property, potential safety concerns, and I gave them the address, the acreage, the number of vehicles already pushing past what any sane limit would allow. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like the system would catch up, like this would be the part where authority stepped in and corrected what never should have happened in the first place. I stayed on the line while headlights appeared at the far end of the access road, red and blue lights cutting through the haze of smoke and dust, and you could feel the shift ripple through the crowd below, conversations lowering, music dipping, people turning to look, because uniforms still carry weight, even in places where they should not be needed. And I watched as two deputies stepped out, hands resting casually at their belts, scanning the scene with that practiced look that measures before it reacts. And Victoria moved toward them immediately. Of course she did. Already smiling, already talking before they even reached her, and I could not hear every word from where I stood, but I did not need to, because I had seen that posture before, the confident lean, the controlled gestures, the way she handed over a sheet of paper like it settled everything. One of the deputies looked up toward the ridge where I stood, then back at her, then down at the document again, and the second one nodded slowly, like something had just been explained in a way that made intervention unnecessary. And that was the moment the illusion cracked. Not for them, not for her, but for anyone who still believed this would be handled cleanly, because a few minutes later, the lights dimmed, the tension eased, and the deputies stepped back toward their vehicles without clearing a single person off my land. I felt it then, that hollow pressure in the chest that comes when the expected outcome does not arrive. When the system you rely on pauses just long enough for someone like Victoria to slip through. And for a brief second, I let that feeling settle, because this was the first real test, the first chance for this to resolve the easy way. And it did not. Not tonight. Not like this. The engine started up again. The music climbed back to its previous volume, and whatever hesitation had crept into the crowd vanished, just as quickly as it had come, because from their perspective, authority had just shown up, looked around, and left, which meant everything here must be acceptable, and Victoria knew it. I could see it in the way she turned back to the group with an even wider smile, like she had just confirmed something for everyone watching, like she had validated the entire event in one smooth exchange. She glanced up toward me again, just once, and this time there was something different in her expression. Not just confidence, but confirmation, like she had checked the final box and found no resistance that mattered. And that was when most people would have made their next move. Pushed harder, called again, escalated louder, but I did not, because now I had exactly what I needed, not resolution, not yet, but clarity, the understanding that this was not going to stop on its own, that it would have to run its course far enough to expose everything she was counting on staying hidden. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and took a slow breath, the air still thick with smoke and dust, and something else now. Something sharper, more defined, like the edge of a plan finally coming into focus, because what looked like a loss from the outside, what felt like a dead end to anyone else standing in my place, was actually the first confirmation that she had overplayed her hand. And as I turned away from the flashing lights fading into the distance and the noise swelling back to full strength behind me, I realized this was never going to be settled by a single call or a single visit. It was going to take something larger. Something she could not talk her way out of, and by letting this continue, by allowing her to believe she had already won, I was giving her exactly what she needed to make that inevitable. By 2 in the morning, the ground had started to change under them, not in a way anyone in that crowd could immediately see, but in the way it felt when you walked across it, softer in places that should have been firm, uneven where tires had cut shallow tracks through soil that had not been compacted for that kind of weight. And I could hear it in the rhythm of movement below. The subtle shift from confident footsteps to careful ones as people adjusted without realizing why. The air had grown heavier too, the smoke no longer drifting cleanly upward but settling low across the pasture, mixing with the dampness rising from the lower field where runoff always collected after repeated pressure. And that was where I saw the first sign that things were starting to drift out of her control. A cluster of campers near the dip, trying to reposition a vehicle that had sunk just enough to stall, engines revving higher than they needed to, spinning tires throwing dirt instead of gaining traction. And around them, more people gathered, not concerned yet, just curious, because to them it was still part of the experience. Further up, closer to the center where Victoria had concentrated most of the activity, the crowd had grown tighter, lines forming for food tables that had been set up without any real spacing, extension cords stretching across walking paths, coolers stacked where there should have been clear access, and every decision that had looked organized an hour ago was starting to overlap, to interfere, to create friction she could not smooth over with a smile and a clipboard. I stayed on the ridge, watching the pattern develop, because this was the stage most people missed, the point where a situation does not collapse, it complicates, and complexity is where control starts to slip. Victoria was still moving through it all, still greeting people, still directing with confident gestures, but now there was a slight edge to her movements, a quicker turn of the head, a second glance at things she would have ignored earlier, and I could see her adjusting in real time, trying to manage the scale she had created. But the problem with scale is that it multiplies faster than you can respond, especially when it was never supposed to exist in the first place. Near the southern fence line, another section had been pushed open to accommodate late arrivals, headlights cutting across areas that had already been disturbed, and with every new vehicle, the margin for error tightened, not dramatically, not in a way that would trigger panic, but enough that the entire operation was now balanced on something thinner than she realized. I walked a little further along the ridge, keeping my distance but changing my angle, and from there I could see the herd in the far pasture, dark shapes against the faint outline of the horizon, calm, steady, exactly where they were supposed to be, but closer now than they had been earlier, drawn by the noise, the lights, the unfamiliar activity pressing into their space, and I knew that proximity mattered, not because anything immediate would happen, but because it changed the dynamic. It introduced a variable that no permit, real or fabricated, could account for. Down below, someone laughed as they stumbled over a cable, another voice called out about finding a better place to park, and Victoria raised her voice just enough to be heard over the music, assuring everyone that everything was under control, that they just needed to spread out a little more, move a little further in, and that was the moment I understood exactly how deep she had committed, because instead of pulling back, instead of reducing the pressure, she was pushing it further into the land, into areas that had never been meant to hold that kind of weight, and every step she took in that direction narrowed her options without her even noticing. I let out a slow breath, feeling the cool edge of the night finally cutting through the smoke, and for a second there was a strange calm in it, the kind that comes when you know the outcome has already started to form even if no one else can see it yet, because this was no longer about stopping anything. It was about letting the conditions align, letting every small miscalculation build on. The last until the situation could no longer support itself. And as I watched her wave another group deeper into the pasture, guiding them toward a space that should have been left untouched, I realized she had just taken the final step from control into inevitability, and she still thought she was in charge. I did not move when the first argument broke out near the lower field. Not loud enough to cut through the music at first. Just a sharp edge in someone's voice that did not belong there, followed by another, and then a third as a small group gathered around one of the vehicles that had sunk deeper than the rest, and from where I stood I could see the driver stepping out, hands raised in frustration, pointing at the ground like it had betrayed him, while someone else tried to direct him forward, not understanding that forward was exactly the problem. The smell of churned dirt carried differently now, heavier, damp in a way that only showed up when pressure exceeded what the land could absorb. And that was when the pattern finally clicked into something more than observation, because this was not just overcrowding anymore. It was misclassification. They were treating this place like a reinforced surface when it was never designed to handle sustained weight in concentrated areas. And every movement they made was amplifying that mistake. I pulled my phone out again, not to call this time, But to open the county records I had already downloaded weeks earlier when Victoria first started circling the edges of my property. Zoning maps, usage restrictions, livestock notices, the kind of documents most people never read until it is too late, and I scrolled through them slowly, confirming what I already knew but needed to see in this context, because now it mattered differently. Now it was not just about ownership. It was about classification and liability and the exact point where her community event stopped being an event and started becoming a violation she could not contain. Down below, another cluster of people began shifting their tents further inward, away from the soft ground, following directions that made sense to them, but only pushed the pressure into areas that had been stable an hour earlier. And I could see Victoria moving faster now, her gestures sharper, her voice raised just enough to carry, telling people to adjust, to spread out, to keep things moving. But the more she corrected, the more she revealed the underlying problem, because organized systems do not need constant adjustment. Only unstable ones do. I zoomed in on one section of the map, the part that outlined designated livestock movement zones, areas that required clear boundaries, unobstructed access, and explicit warnings when human activity overlapped, and I felt that quiet shift again, the same one I had felt earlier, but stronger now, because this was the gap, the one she had stepped over without realizing it existed, the one that turned inconvenience into consequence. I looked up from the screen and back out across the pasture, tracing the line from the broken fence sections to the clusters of campers, to the vehicles, to the narrowing paths that were no longer clear, and then further out to where the herd stood, still calm, still controlled, but now positioned closer to those designated zones than they had been at the start of the night. Not because anything had been forced, but because the environment around them had shifted enough to guide their movement naturally. Someone shouted again near the lower field, louder this time, and a small group stepped back as a vehicle finally gave up trying to move, tires sunk just deep enough to hold it in place. And around them, more people started noticing, not panicking, not yet, but asking questions, looking for direction, and for the first time since this started, I saw uncertainty ripple outward instead of confidence. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and let the cool air settle in my lungs, steady and controlled, because this was the moment most people would have acted, stepped in, pointed out the violation, forced a stop while it was still manageable. But that would have been a mistake, because manageable problems get managed, they get explained away, minimized, contained, and what I needed was something that could not be contained, something that made every shortcut she had taken visible. All at once, Victoria turned in a slow circle near the center of the field, scanning, recalculating, and for the first time, her movements did not match the situation around her, like she was one step behind the reality she had created, and that was when I knew for certain she had crossed into territory she did not understand, and the only thing left now was time. Time for the pressure to build, time for the gaps to widen, time for everything she had stacked on top of this land to reach the point where it could no longer hold. And as I took one step back from the edge of the ridge, letting the distance grow between me and the noise below, I realized she was finally standing inside the mistake she thought she was controlling, and she still had no idea how far it was going to go. I did not need to guess anymore. By 3 in the morning, the evidence was everywhere if you knew how to look for it. Not in one dramatic failure, but in 100 small fractures stacking on top of each other. And I moved along the ridge with my phone out. Not rushing, not reacting, just recording every angle, every detail, the glow of headlights cutting across restricted zones, extension cords stretched over damp soil, clusters of tents pushed deeper into areas marked for livestock movement. And I made sure to capture the context, the banner, the crowd size, the density, the way vehicles were positioned without any clear access lanes, because none of this mattered in isolation, but together it told a story that could not be rewritten later. The air had cooled enough that the smoke settled closer to the ground, carrying the sharp mix of propane, trampled grass, and overheated engines, and beneath it all there was a new sound emerging, subtle at first, then more consistent. The low murmur of confusion spreading through the crowd as more people started running into the same problems, blocked paths, soft ground, unclear directions, and every time someone asked where to go, the answer pointed them further inward, deeper into the exact areas that should have remained untouched. I crouched near the fence line and zoomed in on one section where a group had set up directly across a marked livestock corridor, the reflective tags on the posts still visible if you knew what they meant, ignored completely by everyone who did not. And I took a steady shot of it, holding the frame long enough to capture both the markers and the tents, because that detail alone would matter later, not tonight. But when someone tried to explain how this was all within guidelines, my thumb hovered over the call log for a second, the instinct still there to escalate, to bring someone else into this, before it went any further. And that was the second false signal, the moment where it almost felt like waiting was the wrong move, like letting this continue might actually risk more than it was worth. But I let the phone drop back to my side, because I could already see where this was going, and stopping it now would only freeze it in a state that could still be defended, still be argued down to a misunderstanding. A sudden flicker of light drew my attention toward the center where one of the generators sputtered, dipped, then roared back to life. And for a brief second the music cut out, leaving a strange silence that exposed everything underneath, the overlapping voices, the uneven movement, the lack of structure. And in that gap, I saw Victoria standing still for the first time all night, not directing, not smiling, just scanning, like she was trying to reconcile what she expected with what was actually happening. It lasted maybe 2 seconds before she snapped back into motion, raising her voice, clapping her hands, pulling attention back to her. But the hesitation had already happened, and once you see that, you cannot unsee it. I shifted my focus back toward the far pasture again, watching the herd, noting their position relative to the movement zones, the way they had adjusted without being pushed, responding to pressure in the environment rather than any direct interaction. And that was the piece that completed the picture, because nothing here was isolated anymore. Not the crowd, not the land, not the livestock. It was all connected through the choices she had made. A man near the lower field raised his voice again, louder this time, calling out about where to move his vehicle, and no one answered immediately, not clearly. And that hesitation spread outward, small, almost invisible, but real. And I captured that too, panning slowly across the field, letting the lens pick up the uncertainty that words could not fully explain. I stood up and took one last look across everything, the lights, the smoke, the movement, the density, and the gaps forming between what was supposed to be happening and what actually was, and I realized there was nothing left to gather, nothing left to confirm, because the situation had crossed the threshold I needed. It was no longer defensible as a controlled event. It was a system under strain, and systems under strain do not recover by being told to stop. They reveal themselves fully. I slipped the phone into my pocket and stepped back from the edge of the ridge, letting the distance grow again, because from this point forward, it was no longer about watching every detail. It was about letting the sequence play out, letting each piece fall into place without interference. And as the music surged back to full volume and Victoria's voice rose above it once more, steady but just a fraction too sharp, I knew she was still trying to hold something together that had already begun to come apart, and she still believed she had time to fix it. By the time the clock edged closer to 4 in the morning, the energy on the ground had shifted from excitement to something thinner, more uncertain, and you could feel it in the way people moved, slower now, more deliberate, like they were waiting for someone to tell them what came next instead of assuming they already knew. And that hesitation was exactly what I had been waiting for. I walked back toward the truck park just beyond the ridge line, boots pressing into familiar ground that had not been touched by any of this, and I pulled open the door just enough to reach inside for the folder I kept behind the seat, thick with documents most people would never think to carry with them. But out here, you either prepare early or you regret it later. And as I flipped it open under the dim glow of the overhead light, the paper felt solid in my hands, real in a way that everything happening below was not. Zoning confirmations, livestock declarations, liability notices filed months ago when I upgraded the fencing and registered the herd movements properly. Every line stamped and dated, every signature where it needed to be. I pulled out my phone again, and this time I made a different call, one that did not go through a dispatcher, one that connected directly to someone who already understood the language of land use and liability without needing it. Explained twice, and when he answered, his voice steady even at this hour, I kept it simple, told him what was happening, how many people, how the land was being used, And there was a pause on the other end that lasted just long enough to say everything, because he understood immediately what this meant if it continued. "Do not stop it yet," he said quietly, not as a suggestion, but as a calculation. And that was the confirmation I needed, because now it was not just instinct, it was alignment. And when you get both at the same time, you do not rush, you hold your position. I ended the call and leaned against the side of the truck, looking back out across the pasture. And for a moment, everything seemed almost normal again. The music still playing, the lights still glowing, people still laughing in pockets where nothing had gone wrong yet. And that was the illusion she was still relying on. The idea that as long as things looked stable in enough places, the whole situation could be framed as under control. But control is not about appearance. It is about structure. And her structure was already compromised. Down below, a group had started moving their vehicles again, trying to reorganize. Space that had already been misused, and each adjustment forced another, like a chain reaction with no clear end point. And I could see Victoria stepping into the middle of it, raising her voice, giving instructions, trying to restore order, but every direction she gave depended on people following it correctly. And with this many variables, that was never going to happen consistently. I closed the folder and set it back inside the truck, not because I was done with it, but because I knew when it would matter. And it was not right now, not while everything was still in motion, not while she still believed she could steer the outcome. I walked back toward the ridge, slower this time, letting the cool air clear the last of the smoke from my lungs. And as I reached the edge again, I noticed something new, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to matter. Small clusters of people stepping back from certain areas, giving space without being told to, reacting to something they could not fully explain. And when I followed their line of sight, I saw it, the subtle shift in the far pasture, the herd adjusting again, not agitated, not uncontrolled, just present in a way they had not been earlier, closer to the zones that had been crossed, responding to pressure the way they always did, naturally, predictably, and entirely outside of anything Victoria had planned for. I stood there for a long moment, watching that alignment take shape, the crowd, the land, the livestock, all moving within the same system now, whether they realized it or not. And I understood exactly where this was headed, not in detail, not in every step, but in outcome, because once a situation like this reaches a certain point, it does not reverse, it resolves, and resolution does not ask permission. Victoria turned again, scanning the field, and this time when she looked up toward the ridge, her expression held something new, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the first real sign that she was starting to see the edges of what she had created. And as the music faltered for just a second before picking back up, and a voice somewhere called out for help moving something that would not budge, I realized she was finally beginning to understand that this was no longer something she could simply manage, and she still had no idea how close she was to losing all of it at once. The plan did not begin with action, it began with restraint, and by the time the horizon started to lighten just enough to separate the sky from the land, I had already decided exactly what I was not going to do. I was not going to confront her again, not going to shut anything down prematurely, not going to give her a clean exit or a chance to reshape what this had become into something smaller than it really was, because the moment had passed for that, and what remained now was precision. The air had cooled enough that the smell of smoke thinned out, replaced by damp earth and the faint metallic scent that always came with heavy use of ground that had not been prepared for it. And below me the crowd was settling into something quieter, not calmer, just slower. People sitting instead of moving, conversations lower, movements more careful, like the energy had burned off but the consequences were still waiting to catch up. I walked along the ridge toward the northern gate, boots finding every familiar rise and dip without effort. And when I reached the section of fencing that mattered, I stopped, resting my hand against the wood that had been reinforced just months earlier, solid, stable, exactly where it needed to be, and I checked the latch without opening it, just feeling the tension, confirming what I already knew, that everything on my side of this equation was intact. From there, I traced the line visually, following the boundary down toward the areas that had been breached earlier, noting the angles, the paths, the way people had naturally created routes through the property that now defined movement more than any original layout ever had. And that was the key, because once people establish paths, They follow them, even when they should not, even when those paths lead somewhere they did not intend to go. I pulled my phone out one more time, not to record, not to call, but to review, scrolling through the footage I had taken, matching it against the map in my head, aligning what was happening in real time with the structure that governed it. And everything fit, every misstep, every overlap, every point of pressure exactly where it needed to be for the next phase to work without interference. Down below, Victoria was still moving, but slower now, her confidence replaced with something more measured, more reactive, and I could see her talking to a smaller group near the center, likely trying to reorganize, to regain a sense of control before morning made everything more visible. And that urgency told me everything I needed to know, because she was no longer expanding, she was containing, and containment means the system has already exceeded its limits. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stepped closer to the gate, just enough to hear the faint shift from the far pasture again. That low, steady presence that had been building all night, not aggressive, not chaotic, just inevitable. And I let that sound settle in the background of everything else, because it was part of the equation now, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. A voice carried up from below, sharper this time. Someone asking where they were supposed to park now. Another voice responding with uncertainty instead of direction. And I could see small groups beginning to hesitate before moving, waiting for guidance that was no longer clear, and that hesitation was the final condition, the one that turns movement into confusion, and confusion into something larger. I placed my hand on the latch. Again, not opening it, just holding it there, feeling the weight of the decision even though it had already been made hours earlier, because this was not about creating anything new. It was about removing a barrier at the exact moment it mattered most, allowing the system she had built to interact with the reality she had ignored. And timing was everything. Too early, and it could be dismissed. Too late, and it could be controlled. But right now, in this narrow window where pressure, confusion, and misalignment had all peaked at once, there was no room left for adjustment. I looked out across the pasture one last time, taking in the lights, the scattered movement, the uneven patterns that had replaced structure, and I found Victoria again in the center of it all, turning slowly, scanning, calculating. And for the first time since this began, she looked like someone trying to solve a problem instead of someone presenting a solution. And that was when I knew it was time, not because anything dramatic had happened yet, but because everything necessary had already been set in motion, and all that remained was to let it connect. I took a slow breath, steady and controlled, and without a word, without a signal, without drawing any attention at all, I let my hand ease off the latch and stepped back into the shadow of the ridge, leaving the boundary exactly as it was, knowing that from this point forward, nothing down there would stay the same, and she would not understand why until it was already too late. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything snapped. It started as a shift so subtle most people would not even recognize it as the beginning of anything. A change in sound more than sight. The steady rhythm of music and conversation breaking into uneven layers, voices rising in pockets instead of blending together, footsteps quickening without direction, and beneath it all, that low, steady presence from the far pasture moving closer into the edges of everything that had been set up where it never should have been. The first real reaction came from a group near the livestock corridor, someone stepping back abruptly, pointing, not in panic, just confusion, because what they were seeing did not match what they expected to be there. And that confusion spread faster than any announcement ever could. One person stepping away leads to another asking why, and suddenly the pattern of movement changes. Not organized, not directed, just reactive. I stayed where I was, just inside the shadow of the ridge, watching as the carefully packed layout Victoria had built began to unravel without a single instruction from me. Because the problem was no longer something she could explain away. It was something people were experiencing directly, and experience does not need permission to override assumption. A line of campers near the center started shifting outward, trying to create space where there was none, bumping into others doing the same thing. And in seconds, the density that had once made everything feel controlled became the very thing that made it impossible to manage. Paths that had been clear an hour ago were now blocked by movement in both directions, and every attempt to fix it added another layer of complication. I saw Victoria push through the crowd, her posture still upright, but her movements sharper now, faster, calling out instructions that no longer carried the same authority they had earlier, because people were no longer looking to her for guidance. They were looking for exits, for open space, for anything that felt stable under their feet. The sound changed again, engines starting up where they had been silent, headlights flicking on one by one, cutting across uneven ground that had already been pushed past its limits. And every vehicle that tried to reposition only tightened the space around it. Because there was no longer a clear direction to move, only pressure to get away from where they were. I took a slow breath, letting the cool air steady everything. Because this was the moment where most people would step in, claim control, assert authority over the chaos. But that would have been a mistake, because this was not chaos, it was consequence, and consequence does not need to be directed, it only needs to be allowed. A voice rose above the rest, calling out for space. Another answered from somewhere unseen. And for a brief second the entire field felt like it was holding its breath, suspended between what had been and what it was becoming. And in that space, everything aligned exactly the way it needed to. The land, the movement, the pressure, all intersecting in a way that no one person could control anymore. Victoria turned in a full circle, scanning, searching for something she could anchor to, some point where her authority still applied. But there was nothing left that responded the way it had before, and I saw it then. The exact moment she understood that this was no longer her event, no longer her system. It was something else entirely, something she had triggered, but could not stop. I stepped back another pace into the darkness, not hiding, just removing myself from the frame completely. Because from this point forward, there was nothing left for me to do. The structure she had built had already collapsed under its own weight, not violently, not dramatically, but inevitably. And as the lights flickered across a field that no longer resembled anything she had promised it would be, I knew she was finally standing inside the full reality of what she had created, and there was no version of this where she could walk away without it following her. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, a pale gray light stretching across the pasture and exposing everything the night had tried to hide. The uneven ground, the scattered equipment, the vehicles sitting at awkward angles where they had been abandoned in the confusion. And for the first time since this started, there was no illusion left to hold it together, no shadows to soften the reality of what had happened here. The air felt different too, cooler, cleaner, the smell of smoke fading into damp earth and trampled grass. And beneath it all there was a quiet that had not existed hours before. Not peace, not calm, just the absence of momentum. Like the entire situation had finally run out of energy. People were still there, but not in the way they had been. No music, no laughter, just low voices, tired movements. Groups packing up with that subdued focus that comes when something has clearly gone wrong, but no one wants to be the one to say it out loud. And everywhere I looked there were signs of what had been ignored the night before. The livestock markers standing in plain sight now. The broken fence sections clearly visible. The compressed ground showing exactly where too much weight had been pushed for too long. I walked down from the ridge at a steady pace, not rushing, not avoiding attention either, just moving through my own land like I always had. And as I passed the outer edge of the crowd, conversations dipped slightly, not because of anything I said or did, but because my presence meant something different now. It meant ownership, reality, a reminder of what this place actually was beyond whatever it had been turned into overnight. Victoria stood near the center. No clipboard now, no confident gestures, just stillness, her posture tight, her eyes moving across the field like she was trying to piece together how it had unraveled this far. And when she saw me approaching, she did not smile. Not this time. There was a question there instead, unspoken but clear. How did this happen? I stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could hear me, without raising my voice, and for a moment neither of us said anything, because everything that needed to be understood was already visible around us. And then she spoke first, something about things getting out of hand, about people not following directions, about factors she could not control, and I let her finish, let her frame it the only way she knew how, as something external, something that had happened to her rather than something she had caused. When she was done, I simply looked past her for a second, out across the pasture where the last of the campers were trying to navigate their way back toward the road, stepping carefully now, respecting the ground in a way they had not hours before. And then I looked back at her and said, "This was never your land to manage." And that was it. No lecture, no raised voice, just a statement that did not need anything added to it. She started to respond, something about permits, about approval, but even she did not sound convinced anymore. Because the proof was all around us, not in documents, not in arguments, but in the outcome itself, in the fact that what she had tried to control had clearly exceeded what she understood. A county truck rolled up near the entrance just then, not urgent, not aggressive, just present, and two officials stepped out, scanning the field with the same measured look I had seen hours earlier. But this time the context was different. This time there was no active event to explain, only the aftermath. And that changes everything. Because it is one thing to justify something in motion, it is another to account for what it leaves behind. I stepped back, giving them space to do what they needed to do. Because my part in this was already finished, everything that mattered had already been set in motion long before they arrived. And as they began asking questions, taking notes, looking at the markers, the fencing, the layout, I could see Victoria trying to keep up, trying to explain, but her words did not carry the same weight anymore. Not in the daylight, not against the reality of what was right in front of them. I turned and walked back toward the ridge without another word, the ground steady under my boots again, the air clear, the noise fading behind me. And as I reached the top and looked back one last time, the entire scene felt smaller somehow, not because it was, but because it had been reduced to what it really was, a mistake that had finally revealed itself fully. And for the first time since the night began, everything was exactly where it belonged again, including the consequences she now had to face. The land sounded like itself again by the end of that day. Not perfectly, not immediately, but close enough that you could feel the difference in your chest when you stood still and listened. The steady quiet replacing the scattered noise, the wind moving clean across open ground instead of catching on tents and tarps and makeshift structures that had no business being there in the first place. And as I walked the perimeter, checking each section of fence one post at a time, I could see exactly where the night had pressed too hard, the soil compacted in uneven patterns, the grass flattened in wide arcs where people had moved without thinking. But even that felt temporary, because land like this does not hold on to chaos. It absorbs it, corrects it, returns to balance if you give it time. I replaced what needed replacing, reset the markers that had been ignored, tightened the lines where they had been pushed loose, not out of anger, not as a reaction, just as part of the process. Because ownership is not proven in a single moment. It is maintained over time, quietly, consistently, in ways most people never notice until something goes wrong. The herd had already settled back into their normal patterns, spread across the pasture with the same calm rhythm. They had carried long before any of this started, and watching them move, steady and unbothered, I could see how little they had actually been affected by the chaos that had surrounded them. Because unlike people, they do not react to noise, they respond to pressure, and once the pressure was gone, so were the effects. News of what happened spread faster than I expected, not because I said anything, but because 500 people leaving a place like that all at once tend to talk. And by the next afternoon, there were conversations happening at the county level that did not involve me directly, questions about permits, about liability, about how something like that had been allowed to reach the scale it did without proper oversight. And I did not need to be in those rooms to know how they were going, because I had already seen the evidence laid out in the open. And evidence does not require explanation when it is clear enough. I saw Victoria one more time, not on my land, not near it, but across the street from the county office a few days later, standing beside her car, phone pressed to her ear, her posture tight in a way that had nothing to do with confidence anymore. And when she noticed me, there was no wave this time, no attempt to reframe anything, just a brief moment where our eyes met, and she looked away first, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The kind that comes when someone finally understands that the situation they tried to control was never theirs to shape in the first place. I did not stop, did not speak, because there was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered had already been established, not through argument, not through force, but through outcome, through the simple fact that reality had corrected the narrative she tried to impose on it. Back on the ridge that evening, with the sun dropping low and the air carrying that familiar mix of dry grass and cooling earth, I stood in the same place where this had started and looked out. Across the pasture, now empty, open, exactly as it was meant to be, and it struck me how quiet justice can be when it is done right. No shouting, no spectacle, just a sequence of choices that lead to a result no one can undo. People like Victoria believe control comes from authority, from paperwork, from the ability to convince others that something is true long enough for it to become accepted. But land does not care about any of that. It responds to what is real, to weight, to movement, to pressure, and when those things are misused, it does not argue, it reveals. I let the silence settle for a moment longer before turning back toward the house, boots steady on ground that felt solid again. And as I walked away, I thought about something my grandfather used to say, not as a warning, but as a fact, that you do not have to fight every battle the moment it appears. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is step back, let people show you exactly how far they are willing to go, and then make sure there is no path left for them to walk back when reality finally catches up. And that is exactly what happened here. I did not release anything. I did not force anything. I just stopped, standing in the way of what was always going to happen once she crossed that line. And in the end, that was more than enough.